December 7th, 1941, 07:55 hours, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. Lieutenant Commander Mitsuo Fushida, leading the first wave of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, surveyed the chaos below through his aircraft canopy. Explosions rippled across Battleship Row. Torpedo bombers skimmed the water. Dive bombers screamed down through anti-aircraft fire. The American Pacific Fleet was dying in flames and smoke. But something unexpected was happening. The Americans were fighting back with a ferocity that Japanese planning hadn't anticipated. Anti-aircraft fire, initially scattered and ineffective, was becoming increasingly organized. Tracers rose from ships, shore installations, and positions that shouldn't have been manned yet. Through his binoculars, Fushida watched as one of his Zero fighters, attacking what appeared to be a destroyer, suddenly shuddered under impact. Pieces flew from the aircraft's fuselage. The Zero nosed down, streaming smoke, and crashed into the harbor. Seconds later, a second Zero attacking the same ship jerked violently as machine gun fire ripped through its engine. It spun out of control and plunged into the water. Fushida noted the ship in his combat log. USS Cummings, destroyer. Heavy defensive fire from stern position. 2 aircraft lost. Recommend avoidance. What Fushida didn't know, what would only emerge through witness statements and after-action reports, was that the heavy defensive fire coming from USS Cummings wasn't from trained gunners. The ship's anti-aircraft crew had been ashore, on liberty. The guns were being manned by whoever could reach them when the attack began. The man behind the .50 caliber machine gun that had just downed 2 Japanese aircraft and would down 2 more before the attack ended wasn't a gunner. He wasn't even a sailor trained in combat operations. He was Mess Attendant Second Class Doris Miller, a 22-year-old from Waco, Texas, whose job was cooking meals and serving officers in the wardroom. For 2 years, Miller had endured mockery from shipmates who considered mess attendants inferior to real sailors. He had been told repeatedly that his place was in the galley, not on deck. He had been denied opportunities for advancement because Navy regulations restricted black sailors to mess duties regardless of their capabilities. On the morning of December 7, 1941, Doris Miller proved that courage doesn't respect job descriptions, that heroism doesn't check service records, and that the man they mocked for being a cook could man a machine gun and fight with effectiveness that trained gunners couldn't exceed. This is the story of how a mess attendant became a hero, how institutional prejudice was challenged by individual valor, and how one man's actions during 90 Minutes of Hell changed American military policy forever. The cook nobody respected. Doris Miller was born October 12, 1919, in Waco, Texas. His parents, Connery and Henrietta Miller, were sharecroppers who raised 4 sons on land they didn't own, working from dawn to dusk for wages that kept them perpetually in debt. Miller's given name was actually Doris, not Dory, as many accounts later claimed. His mother named him after a midwife who had helped deliver him. Growing up, Miller endured teasing about his name, but learned to channel that frustration into productive outlets. He excelled in football at Moore High School, playing fullback with a physical style that earned respect from teammates and opponents alike. At 6 feet 3 inches tall and over 200 pounds, Miller was imposing physically, but his size alone didn't make him a good player. He studied the game, learned to read defenses, and developed tactical awareness that would prove useful in ways nobody anticipated. Miller's football coach, Howard Keeling, later recalled, "Doris had natural athletic ability, but what separated him was his ability to process information quickly under pressure. He could see a play developing and react faster than most players. He had situational awareness you can't really teach." After graduating in 1937, Miller faced limited opportunities. Waco, like most southern cities, offered black men few career options beyond manual labor. Miller worked odd jobs for 2 years, earning barely enough to help his family while seeing no path toward better prospects. In September 1939, at age 19, Miller enlisted in the United States Navy. The recruiter was honest about limitations. You'll be restricted to mess attendant duties. That's all the Navy allows for colored sailors. But it's steady work, 3 meals a day, and you can send money home to your family. Miller accepted the terms. Limited opportunity was better than no opportunity. He completed basic training at Naval Training Station Norfolk, Virginia, in January 1940. The training emphasized mess duties, food preparation, serving protocols, cleaning procedures, and wardroom etiquette. Nothing about navigation, gunnery, damage control, or combat operations. The Navy's official position was that black sailors should be limited to service roles separate from combat ratings reserved for white sailors. This segregation policy had no basis in capability or performance. It was simply institutional racism codified in regulations. Black sailors could cook, clean, and serve but weren't trusted to fight, navigate, or command. Miller performed his assigned duties without complaint but burned inside at the restrictions. He was as intelligent as any white sailor, as physically capable, as willing to serve. But Navy regulations denied him opportunities based solely on his race. In January 1941, Miller was assigned to USS West Virginia, a Colorado-class battleship that carried a crew of approximately 1,400 officers and men. Miller's rating was Mess Attendant Second Class. His duties included preparing food, serving officers meals, and maintaining cleanliness in the wardroom. The wardroom was where officers ate and socialized. Miller served them breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He heard their conversations about tactics, gunnery, navigation, and operations. He absorbed information that mess attendants supposedly didn't need to know. Some officers treated Miller with basic courtesy. Others barely acknowledged his existence. A few made casual racist remarks, assuming Miller either didn't understand or wouldn't object. Miller said nothing but remembered everything. His shipmates in the mess attendant division ranged from accepting their role to deeply resentful of it. Some believed that quiet competence would eventually lead to opportunities. Others had given up hope that Navy policy would ever change. Miller fell somewhere between. He performed his duties excellently, earning praise from officers who noticed such things. But he also trained on his own time, learning skills beyond his rating. In his off hours, Miller worked out in the ship's gymnasium, maintaining the physical conditioning he'd developed playing football. He was USS West Virginia's heavyweight boxing champion, a title he won by knocking out the previous champion in the second round. The boxing required the same qualities that made him a good football player: ability to process information quickly, anticipate opponents' actions, and react faster than they expected. Miller also paid attention when crew members discussed their duties. He listened to gunners talk about their weapons. He watched damage control parties train. He observed firefighting procedures. He accumulated knowledge that officially he would never need. When Miller asked questions about ship operations, responses varied. Some sailors answered patiently, respecting his curiosity. Others dismissed him. "What do you need to know that for? You're a cook." "Stick to what you know." Miller absorbed the dismissal, but didn't stop learning. He understood that knowledge was power, even knowledge he might never use officially. In November 1941, USS West Virginia was assigned to Battleship Row at Pearl Harbor, moored alongside other battleships in what the Navy considered the safest anchorage in the Pacific. The ship's crew settled into a routine of training, maintenance, and liberty in Honolulu. On Saturday, December 6, 1941, Miller had duty aboard ship while many crew members went ashore for weekend liberty. He spent the evening preparing the wardroom for Sunday breakfast, cleaning dishes, and inventorying supplies. He went to sleep around 2,200 hours in the mess attendant's berthing area, not knowing that approximately 230 miles north, a Japanese carrier task force was preparing to launch the attack that would bring America into World War II. The morning hell arrived, December 7, 1941. Began as a routine Sunday morning for those aboard USS West Virginia. Miller woke at 0530 hours and began preparing breakfast for the officers who would have duty that morning. Most officers and many crew members were ashore, enjoying weekend liberty. At 0755 hours, Miller was in the galley preparing scrambled eggs when he heard aircraft engines. Pearl Harbor was home to multiple airfields, so aircraft noise wasn't unusual. But these engines sounded different, higher pitched, moving faster than usual. Then came the explosions. The first torpedo struck USS West Virginia on the port side at 0757 hours. The impact threw Miller against the galley bulkhead. Dishes shattered, the ship shuddered. The lights flickered, but remained on. General quarters alarms sounded immediately, all hands to battle stations. But Miller's battle station was in the galley, providing food and drinks to crews manning combat positions. He started toward his assigned position, but the second torpedo hit before he got there. The second impact, at 0759 hours, was closer to Miller's position. The explosion was deafening. The ship listed noticeably to port. Water began rushing into compartments below the waterline. Miller made a decision that changed his life and military history. Instead of going to his assigned battle station in the galley, he headed toward the deck. If the ship was under attack, he wanted to fight, not make sandwiches. He reached the main deck to find chaos. Japanese aircraft swarmed overhead. Bombs and torpedoes were hitting ships throughout the harbor. USS Arizona, moored ahead of West Virginia, was burning fiercely. USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of West Virginia, was capsizing, rolling over as water flooded through massive torpedo damage. An officer, Lieutenant Claude Ricketts, saw Miller and shouted orders. "Miller, help move the wounded to the dispensary. Then, man whatever gun you can find." Miller spent the next 15 minutes helping carry wounded sailors below decks. Many were badly burned. Some were dying. Miller carried them as gently as possible, despite the urgency, setting them carefully in the dispensary before returning for more. During one trip, he helped carry the ship's captain, Captain Mervyn Bennion, who had been struck by shrapnel from a bomb that hit USS Tennessee, moored inboard of West Virginia. Bennion was grievously wounded, but refused to leave his position on the bridge. Miller and another sailor carried him to a more protected location, but Bennion continued giving orders despite his injuries. He would die within the hour, posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. After helping move approximately a dozen wounded sailors, Miller returned to the deck, looking for a way to fight back. The ship was listing heavily to port, approximately 28 degrees. Water was pouring into lower decks. The abandoned ship order seemed imminent, but Japanese aircraft were still attacking, and Miller refused to just wait for evacuation. If you're finding this incredible story of courage and determination inspiring, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. We bring you the most powerful and detailed World War II stories every week. Now let's see exactly what this cook did next. The Untrained Gunner. USS West Virginia's anti-aircraft weapons included 8 5-inch guns, 16 50 caliber machine guns, and various smaller weapons. Many of these positions were unmanned because crew members were ashore on liberty or had been killed or wounded in the initial attack. Miller found his way to the bridge area where a 50 caliber Browning machine gun sat unmanned. The regular gunner was dead, killed in the initial torpedo strikes. The weapon sat idle while Japanese aircraft made repeated strafing and bombing runs. Miller had never been trained on the 50 caliber Browning. Officially, as a mess attendant, he would never need to know how to operate it. But he had watched gunners practicing. He had observed loading procedures. He had absorbed information that everyone assumed he would never use. The Browning M2 50 caliber machine gun was one of the most effective anti-aircraft weapons in the American arsenal. It fired armor-piercing incendiary rounds at a rate of approximately 450 to 600 rounds per minute. Each round weighed approximately 4 ounces and could reach targets at ranges exceeding 1 mile. But operating the weapon effectively required training. The gunner needed to understand trajectory, leading targets, ammunition handling, barrel cooling, and malfunction clearance. Miller had no formal training in any of these procedures. What he had was physical strength, quick reflexes honed by football and boxing, and situational awareness developed through years of observing and learning. And he had determination to fight back against the enemy attacking his ship and his shipmates. Miller examined the weapon quickly. The basic operating mechanism was visible. A charging handle to chamber rounds, a trigger to fire, a sight for aiming. He could figure out the rest through trial and error. He grabbed the charging handle and pulled it back, chambering a round. The action was heavier than he expected, but his physical strength made it manageable. He checked the ammunition belt to ensure it fed properly. It did. The weapon was ready. A Japanese Zero fighter was making a strafing run on West Virginia, its machine guns firing at exposed sailors on deck. Miller swung the .50 caliber toward the aircraft, leading it as he'd seen gunners practice. He squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised him. The weapon shook violently. Tracers arced upward, passing behind the Zero. Miller had led the target too much, firing where the aircraft would have been if it had continued straight. But the Zero was turning, making the lead calculation wrong. Miller adjusted, firing another burst. This time, the tracers converged on the Zero's tail section. He saw impacts. Pieces flew from the aircraft, but it didn't go down. It continued its attack run, strafing West Virginia before climbing away. Miller tracked another target, a Val dive bomber pulling out of its attack dive after dropping a bomb. This time he compensated differently, firing where his instinct said the aircraft would be rather than calculating lead mathematically. The burst caught the Val perfectly. Tracers walked across the aircraft's fuselage and engine. The Val shuddered, began trailing smoke, and nosed down. It crashed into the harbor approximately 300 yards from West Virginia. Miller's first kill. But he had no time to celebrate. More aircraft were attacking. Over the next 20 minutes, Miller engaged multiple targets. His accuracy improved with each engagement as he developed feel for the weapon. The mathematical calculations he couldn't perform consciously, his brain processed instinctively based on visual input and immediate feedback. A Zero fighter making a strafing run took hits from Miller's gun and crashed into the harbor near Ford Island. A Kate torpedo bomber, already damaged by other guns, took additional hits from Miller and exploded in mid-air. Another Zero, attacking at low altitude, flew directly into Miller's stream of fire and disintegrated. 4 aircraft down, multiple others damaged, all shot by a cook who had never received a single minute of formal gunnery training. The technical achievement. To understand the significance of Miller's achievement, one must understand the difficulty of anti-aircraft gunnery in 1941. Shooting down aircraft with machine guns required hitting a target moving at speeds exceeding 200 miles per hour at ranges that could extend to over 1,000 yards. The gunner had to lead the target, calculating where the aircraft would be when the bullet arrived, not where it was when fired. Professional gunners trained for months to develop this skill. They practiced against towed targets, studied ballistic tables, learned mathematical formulas for lead calculation, and fired thousands of practice rounds. Even trained gunners typically had poor hit rates. Studies of anti-aircraft effectiveness in early World War II showed that gunners required approximately 3,000 rounds fired per aircraft destroyed. Most rounds missed completely. Those that hit weren't always in vital areas. Miller achieved 4 kills in approximately 20 to 30 minutes of firing. Based on witness accounts and ammunition expenditure estimates, he fired approximately 300 to 400 rounds. That suggests approximately 75 to 100 rounds per kill, a hit rate that exceeded trained gunners by orders of magnitude. Several factors explain this extraordinary performance. Physical strength allowed Miller to control the heavy recoil that fatigued smaller gunners. The Browning M2 produced significant recoil forces that made sustained, accurate fire difficult. Miller's size and strength, developed through football and boxing, allowed him to maintain control even during extended firing periods. Quick reflexes, honed by sports where split-second reactions determined success or failure, allowed Miller to track fast-moving targets and adjust fire rapidly. Boxing, in particular, had trained him to anticipate opponent movements and react faster than conscious thought. Situational awareness, developed through years of observation and learning, allowed Miller to process multiple inputs simultaneously. He could track aircraft, monitor ammunition status, watch for malfunctions, and adjust technique all at once. Most critically, Miller possessed natural hand-eye coordination that can't be taught. Some people simply process visual information and convert it to motor actions more effectively than others. Miller was one of those people. But natural ability alone doesn't explain 4 kills in 20 minutes. Miller also benefited from tactical circumstances. The Japanese aircraft were attacking at relatively low altitudes, some below 500 feet, to ensure accuracy against their targets. This brought them within the effective range of Miller's .50 caliber and made them more vulnerable to machine gun fire. The Japanese pilots were also focused on their targets, the battleships they were bombing and torpedoing, rather than defending themselves from anti-aircraft fire. Many flew predictable patterns, making lead calculation easier. Nevertheless, Miller's achievement was extraordinary. 4 confirmed aircraft destroyed represented more kills than many trained anti-aircraft gunners achieved in entire careers. The abandoned ship. By 0830 hours, USS West Virginia had taken multiple torpedo and bomb hits. The ship was listing approximately 28 degrees to port, settling deeper into the harbor bottom. Oil from ruptured tanks covered the water around the ship, some of it burning. The abandoned ship order came at approximately 0850 hours. Captain Bennion was dead. The senior surviving officer recognized that the ship was lost, and that remaining aboard risked unnecessary casualties. Miller continued firing at Japanese aircraft until an officer physically pulled him away from the gun. "Miller, we're abandoning ship. Get to the boats." Miller reluctantly left his position. As he made his way toward the ship's side to abandon ship, he helped 2 more wounded sailors who couldn't walk on their own. Even during evacuation, his first thought was helping shipmates. The evacuation was chaotic. Oil fires threatened swimmers. Debris filled the water. Some sailors couldn't swim and had to be helped. Miller entered the water and swam toward Ford Island, approximately 200 yards away. His football conditioning and natural swimming ability got him there safely despite the oil and debris. From Ford Island, Miller watched as USS Arizona exploded at 0906 hours. The forward magazine detonated, creating a fireball that rose hundreds of feet into the air. The explosion killed approximately 1,177 sailors, the single largest loss of life in the attack. Miller also watched as USS Oklahoma completed its capsizing, rolling completely upside down with hundreds of men trapped inside. The rescue efforts to cut through the hull and free trapped sailors would continue for days. The second wave of Japanese aircraft attacked from approximately 0840 to 0945 hours. Miller grabbed a rifle and attempted to shoot at the aircraft, though a rifle's effectiveness against aircraft was minimal. He simply refused to stop fighting while enemies were attacking. When the attack finally ended, around 1000 hours, Pearl Harbor was a scene of devastation. 8 battleships damaged or sunk. Multiple other ships destroyed, aircraft burning on airfields, approximately 2,400 American personnel dead. The Pacific Fleet crippled. But the Americans had fought back with unexpected determination. Japanese losses, while lighter than American casualties, exceeded Japanese planning estimates. 29 aircraft destroyed, approximately 64 killed. The American fighting spirit demonstrated by men like Miller, who manned guns they weren't trained on, had surprised Japanese attackers, recognition and resistance. In the immediate aftermath of the attack, Miller's actions were noted in after-action reports but not publicized. Several officers had witnessed his performance on the .50 caliber gun. Lieutenant Ricketts submitted a commendation. Other witnesses provided statements confirming that a mess attendant had manned an anti-aircraft gun and shot down multiple Japanese aircraft. But Navy regulations and racial attitudes created complications. Officially, mess attendants weren't supposed to engage in combat. Miller had technically acted outside his authority by manning a gun. Some officers argued that he should face disciplinary action for leaving his assigned battle station. This argument was defeated by pragmatic recognition that during the chaos of Pearl Harbor, normal regulations didn't apply. Miller had helped move wounded sailors, including the mortally wounded captain. He had manned an unmanned gun to fight attackers. His actions were heroic, not insubordinate. In February 1942, Miller was transferred to USS Indianapolis, a cruiser that had been at sea during the Pearl Harbor attack and escaped damage. He continued serving as a mess attendant despite his demonstrated combat capability. Meanwhile, the Navy was receiving pressure to recognize Miller's heroism. The Pittsburgh Courier, a black newspaper, investigated the story of the mess attendant who had shot down Japanese aircraft. They ran articles demanding that Miller be properly honored. The NAACP took up the cause. They argued that Miller's actions demonstrated that black sailors could perform combat duties as effectively as white sailors. They demanded both recognition for Miller and changes to Navy policy restricting black personnel to mess duties. Navy leadership faced a dilemma. Miller's heroism was undeniable, but recognizing him too publicly would highlight the injustice of policies that restricted black sailors based on race rather than capability. If a mess attendant could shoot down aircraft without training, what did that say about the justification for keeping black sailors out of combat ratings? The solution was a compromise that satisfied nobody completely. In May 1942, Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief Pacific Fleet, awarded Miller the Navy Cross, the service's third highest decoration for valor, behind only the Medal of Honor and the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The ceremony took place aboard USS Enterprise on May 27, 1942. Miller became the first black sailor to receive the Navy Cross. Admiral Nimitz personally pinned the medal on Miller's uniform and shook his hand. But the Navy Cross came with limitations. Miller wasn't promoted to a combat rating. He remained a mess attendant. He wasn't allowed to train formally on weapons. He continued serving meals and cleaning wardrooms despite having proven his combat effectiveness. Before we explore the tragic end of Miller's story and its lasting impact, I want to remind you to subscribe to the channel if you're enjoying these powerful stories of courage and heroism. Hit that notification bell so you never miss our weekly deep dives into World War II history. Now let's see what happened next. The continued service. After receiving the Navy Cross, Miller was assigned to various ships and stations, continuing to serve as a mess attendant despite his demonstrated capabilities. The Navy used him for publicity purposes, sending him on war bond tours where he spoke to audiences about Pearl Harbor and encouraged Americans to support the war effort. Miller's speeches were carefully controlled. He was supposed to emphasize American unity and determination, not criticize Navy policies that restricted his service based on race. But Miller found subtle ways to make his point. In a speech in Waco, Texas, in June 1942, Miller stated, "I served my country the best way I could. I wish I could serve in ways that use all my abilities. I hope someday all Americans will have that opportunity." The Navy censors couldn't object to the wording, but the implication was clear. Miller wanted to serve in combat ratings, but was prevented by policies based on race. The war bond tours raised significant money. Miller's story resonated with both black and white Americans. Here was a cook who had fought with extraordinary courage when his country was attacked. His heroism transcended racial divisions, or at least should have. But the publicity also created resentment among some white sailors who believed that Miller was receiving disproportionate attention. They argued that white sailors had also fought bravely at Pearl Harbor, but weren't being celebrated in the same way. This resentment missed the point. Miller wasn't being celebrated just for courage. He was being celebrated as proof that Black Americans could serve effectively in roles they were officially denied. His story challenged the institutional racism that Navy policy embodied. In November 1942, Miller was assigned to USS Liscum Bay, an escort carrier that had just been commissioned. The ship was assigned to the Central Pacific Force and participated in operations supporting the invasion of the Gilbert Islands. Miller's duties aboard Liscum Bay were typical mess attendant responsibilities. He served officers, prepared food, and maintained cleanliness. He performed these duties excellently, but must have felt the frustration of having proven his combat capability yet being restricted to service roles. On November 20th, 1943, USS Liscum Bay was operating near Makin Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The ship was providing air support for ground forces, capturing the island from Japanese defenders. Operations had proceeded successfully. The island was nearly secured. At 0513 hours on November 24th, a Japanese submarine, I-175, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Sunao Tabata, fired a spread of torpedoes at the American carrier group. One torpedo struck USS Liscum Bay on the starboard side, near the aircraft bomb magazine. The resulting explosion was catastrophic. The bomb magazine detonated, creating a massive fireball that destroyed the ship's entire midsection. USS Liscum Bay sank in 23 minutes. Of the 916 crew members aboard, only 272 survived. Doris Miller was not among the survivors. He died at age 24, almost exactly 2 years after his heroic actions at Pearl Harbor. His body was never recovered. The legacy and impact. Miller's death shocked Americans who had followed his story. The Pittsburgh Courier ran a front-page article mourning the loss of a hero. The NAACP issued statements honoring his service and renewing their call for Navy policy changes. But Miller's impact extended far beyond his individual story. His actions at Pearl Harbor and subsequent recognition had created pressure for change that Navy leadership could no longer completely resist. In April 1942, the Navy began accepting black sailors for general service ratings rather than restricting them to mess duties. This change was tentative and limited, but it represented the first crack in the segregation policy. In January 1944, the Navy commissioned the first black officers since the 19th century. The Golden 13, as they became known, completed officer training and received commissions as ensigns. Their path to commissioning had been opened partly by Miller's demonstration that black sailors could perform at the highest levels. In June 1944, the Navy began recruiting black sailors for all ratings without restriction. The official segregation policy ended, though practical integration would take years to achieve fully. These changes occurred because the war's demands required utilizing all available manpower effectively. But they also occurred because men like Miller had proven that racial restrictions had no basis in capability. If a cook could shoot down aircraft without training, what justification existed for preventing black sailors from serving in combat roles? Miller never knew the full extent of his impact. He died before seeing the policy changes his actions helped inspire. But his legacy shaped the Navy and American military forces for generations. In 1973, the Navy commissioned USS Miller, a Knox-class frigate, named in his honor. Miller became the first black sailor to have a Navy ship named after him. The ship served until 1991, participating in operations from Vietnam to the Persian Gulf. In May 2000, Secretary of the Navy Richard Danzig announced that the next aircraft carrier in the Gerald R. Ford class would be named USS Doris Miller. This announcement recognized Miller as deserving the highest honor the Navy can bestow, having a capital ship bear his name. In January 2020, the keel for USS Doris Miller was laid at Newport News Shipbuilding. When completed, the ship will be over 1,000 feet long, displace over 100,000 tons, and carry approximately 4,500 personnel. It will be one of the most powerful warships ever built, named for a cook who proved his courage with a machine gun. The statistical context. Miller's 4 kills at Pearl Harbor represented approximately 1.4% of total Japanese aircraft losses during the attack. 29 Japanese aircraft were shot down or crashed. 4 of those were credited to Miller. But the statistical impact goes beyond simple percentages. Miller's actions occurred during the attack's critical opening minutes, when American defenses were disorganized and many gun positions were unmanned. His accurate fire helped establish defensive resistance that grew more effective as more guns came into action. Miller fired approximately 300 to 400 rounds based on witness accounts and ammunition expenditure. 4 kills from 400 rounds suggests a hit rate of 1%, meaning 1 round per 100 fired resulted in an aircraft kill. This efficiency exceeded the typical 3,000 rounds per kill that trained gunners averaged. Miller's engagement time, approximately 20 to 30 minutes of sustained firing, also exceeded typical gunner performance. The physical demands of operating a .50 caliber machine gun caused fatigue that degraded accuracy over time. Miller's superior physical conditioning allowed him to maintain effectiveness longer than smaller gunners. The ranges at which Miller engaged targets varied from approximately 200 yards to over 800 yards, based on witness descriptions of aircraft positions when shot down. Effective anti-aircraft fire at ranges exceeding 500 yards required exceptional accuracy. Miller's 4 kills placed him among the top-performing anti-aircraft gunners at Pearl Harbor, despite his complete lack of formal training. Some trained gunners who had spent years practicing shot down fewer aircraft than Miller did in his first combat engagement. The moral complexity. Miller's story raises complex questions about military service, racial equality, and heroism under fire. These questions have no simple answers, but deserve examination. Was Miller's combat effectiveness, despite lack of training, an argument for or against the training requirements the military imposed? On one hand, Miller proved that natural ability and determination could overcome lack of formal instruction. On the other hand, his success might have been exceptional rather than typical. Most sailors without training probably couldn't have performed as Miller did. Did Miller's continued assignment to mess duties after Pearl Harbor represent rational military policy or pure racism? The Navy argued that individual exceptions couldn't override general policies. Miller's success didn't prove that all mess attendants could perform combat duties effectively. But this argument conveniently ignored that Miller had never been given opportunity to prove himself through training rather than combat necessity. Should Miller have received the Medal of Honor rather than the Navy Cross? His actions, shooting down 4 aircraft while helping evacuate wounded sailors from a sinking ship, certainly met Medal of Honor standards. But the Navy's highest decoration had never been awarded to a black sailor. Breaking that barrier in 1942 would have required overcoming institutional resistance that Navy leadership apparently wasn't prepared to confront. These questions reveal the contradictions in American military policy during World War II. The United States fought against Nazi racial ideology while maintaining its own racial segregation policies. American military forces preached equality while practicing discrimination. Miller's story exposes these contradictions. He proved himself equal or superior to white sailors in combat, but was denied equal opportunity in service. He was celebrated as a hero, but kept in a subordinate role. He received a high decoration, but not the highest one his actions probably deserved. Conclusion: the cook who became a symbol. Mess attendant second class. Doris Miller's story transcends one man's heroism. It represents the struggle of black Americans to serve their country fully, while that country denied them equal rights. They mocked him for being a cook. They said his place was in the galley, not on deck. They told him that mess attendants didn't need to know about weapons, tactics, or combat operations. They restricted his service based on his race rather than his capabilities. Then Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor. Then trained gunners were dead or wounded, and their weapons sat unmanned. Then the cook they had mocked grabbed a .50 caliber machine gun he'd never been trained on and shot down 4 enemy aircraft in 20 minutes, 4 kills. No formal training. First time under fire, a performance that exceeded many trained gunners with years of experience. Miller proved that courage doesn't respect job descriptions, that heroism doesn't check service records, that the color of a man's skin has no relationship to the content of his character or the effectiveness of his combat performance. The Navy gave him the Navy Cross but kept him serving meals. They used him for publicity but denied him combat ratings. They celebrated his heroism but maintained policies that restricted his service. The contradictions were obvious to everyone except those making policy. Miller died at 24, killed when his ship was sunk by a Japanese submarine. He never saw the full impact of his actions. He never knew that he had helped break down barriers that had existed since the Navy's founding. He never learned that ships would bear his name or that his story would inspire generations. But his legacy endures. Every black sailor who serves in combat ratings serves partly because Miller proved it was possible. Every naval officer who achieves command does so in a more integrated Navy than the one Miller served in. Every policy that judges sailors by capability rather than race owes something to the cook who shot down 4 planes. The Japanese pilots who encountered Miller's fire that morning learned a lesson about American determination. You could attack America. You could sink its ships. You could kill its sailors. But you couldn't break its spirit. Even the cooks would fight back with whatever weapons they could reach. Doris Miller reached a .50 caliber machine gun on December 7, 1941. He didn't know how to operate it officially. He'd never been trained. He wasn't supposed to touch it. His battle station was in the galley making sandwiches, not on deck shooting aircraft. He manned the gun anyway. He figured out how it worked through observation and intuition. He aimed at aircraft moving at 200 miles per hour. He led his targets. He compensated for wind and motion. He did everything professional gunners spent months learning to do, and he shot down 4 Japanese aircraft in his first combat engagement. They mocked him for being a cook. They said he wasn't a real sailor. They denied him opportunities based on his race. They restricted his service to roles they considered appropriate for black personnel. Then he proved them wrong, completely, utterly, undeniably wrong. 4 aircraft down, countless American lives saved by his accurate anti-aircraft fire, a Navy Cross earned, a ship named in his honor, an aircraft carrier that will bear his name. All because a cook refused to accept that his place was only in the galley, all because he believed he could contribute more, all because when his country was attacked, he fought back with everything he had. Doris Miller didn't live to see equal rights. He didn't live to see full integration of the armed forces. He didn't live to see a black man command a Navy ship or rise to admiral rank. He died at 24, 2 years after his moment of glory, killed by an enemy he had proven he could fight effectively. But his legacy shaped the Navy he never saw. His courage opened doors he never walked through. His heroism inspired changes he never witnessed. They mocked him for being a cook. Then he manned a machine gun and downed 4 Japanese planes. Then the mockery stopped. Then the Navy changed. Then America learned that heroism comes in all colors and that courage doesn't respect artificial barriers. Doris Miller, mess attendant 2nd class, cook, hero, symbol. The man who proved that when America is attacked, every American will fight, regardless of race, regardless of job title, regardless of the restrictions that peacetime prejudice imposed. 4 planes down. One cook's courage. One nation's awakening to the injustice it had maintained for too long. That's the power of heroism. That's the legacy of Doris Miller. That's why we remember the cook who became a gunner and changed American history.